On a stormy night in Boston, a girl was forced by her stepmother to wash dishes under the rain. What seemed like a simple punishment became the most painful revelation when her father, a pilot returning home unexpectedly, discovered the truth that would change their lives forever. What city are you watching this video from, and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. And before we continue, let me wish you health and peace. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? Fall had settled in Boston with fine rains that slid down the brick rooftops and soaked the centuries-old stones of Faneuil Hall. Javier Ortega, Delta captain, walked through Logan Airport Terminal with firm steps and impeccable uniform. He had just landed after a transatlantic flight, and although he was exhausted, in his chest burned the desire to return home. There, his new wife, Carmen Salgado, and his 8-year-old daughter, Lucia, waited for him. Since he had lost his first wife, Javier had lived with the sensation of an impossible void to fill. That's why he believed in the second chance life offered him upon meeting Carmen. He thought that elegant woman, with her confident smile, would bring stability and affection to the girl. The taxi advanced through Boston's wet streets, where street lamps spilled a warm glow over the damp brick. Javier observed through the window, recognizing familiar corners, bars with specials announced on chalkboards, and groups of students running under umbrellas. He smiled, imagining Lucia running toward him with the same joy as always. A colleague shortly before landing had told him jokingly, "You're a fortunate man, Javier. Prestigious job, young wife, and a daughter who adores you." Javier had laughed, but deep down he wished those words were really true. Upon opening the apartment door, Carmen appeared radiant in a red dress that stood out under the lamp's golden light. "Welcome home, my love," she exclaimed, wrapping Javier in a hug that seemed perfect. However, just behind her appeared Lucia, with her braids somewhat undone and moistened eyes. She ran to her father and surrounded him with thin arms, hiding her face in his chest as if fearing he would disappear again. Javier lifted her, kissing her hair that smelled of cheap soap, and for an instant felt nothing bad could exist in the world. Dinner was prepared on the table, varied dishes, freshly baked bread, and an open bottle of California wine. Javier raised his glass, emotional. "Let's toast to this new stage, to our family." Carmen nodded with elegance while Lucia, in silence, held a glass of orange juice. During the meal, Javier recounted anecdotes from his flight: restless passengers, takeoff under the rain, the crew's jokes. Carmen listened with feigned attention, interspersing comments full of admiration. In anyone's eyes, they were a happy family. But Lucia barely tasted a bite. Her eyes stopped again and again on the empty chair at the table's end, the one her mother had occupied until the last day. Javier noticed it, the slight tremor in the girl's hand, the way she pressed her lips. He wanted to say something, but limited himself to caressing her hand under the table. Lucia withdrew it gently, murmuring barely audibly, "I'm fine, Dad." He accepted that white lie with a lump in his throat. When they finished, Carmen stood up to gather the plates with skill, moving through the kitchen as if everything were in order. Javier accompanied Lucia to her room. The room still kept a portrait of her mother on the desk. The girl looked at it for a long time before getting into bed. Javier adjusted the blanket, gave her a kiss on the forehead, and whispered, "Rest, my girl." She closed her eyes, though her mouth's expression betrayed an invisible weight. Back in the living room, Javier contemplated Carmen, always smiling, always perfect. He breathed in the wine's aroma, let himself fall into the armchair, and wanted to convince himself he had done the right thing by remaking his life. And yet, while the hallway clock marked midnight and the rain continued hitting the windows, a bitter doubt settled in his mind. Javier wonders if he has truly managed to build the home he so desired. The university bells resonated in the distance when Lucia, barely 8 years old, leaned over a metal basin full of greasy dishes. The ice-cold water numbed her hands while she tried to fulfill Carmen's order. Finish the dishes on the patio, even though a persistent drizzle soaked her dress. The girl obeyed in silence, aware that any protest would only awaken her stepmother's impatience. Carmen watched her from the threshold, arms crossed in severe gaze. The woman justified her harshness with cutting phrases. "It's for your own good. This way you'll learn to be strong." In public she was kind and elegant, but within those walls she showed a coldness that froze more than the rain. Lucia, resigned, tried to smile when her father was home. She never told him what happened in his absence. She feared that he, tired from flying, would feel disappointed or guilty. A neighbor, Mrs. Pilar, looked out from her window in the adjacent apartment. Her eyes followed the scene with a worried expression. "That poor girl is always alone when her father flies," she murmured to another neighbor on the street. The women shook their heads with disapproval, but none dared intervene. Boston was a small city of quick gossip and long silences. The cold water made Lucia drop a plate. The sharp blow against the stone floor broke the afternoon silence. The piece of china broke into 1,000 pieces and a choked sob escaped her lips. Carmen frowned, took a step forward, and without raising her voice sentenced, "Tomorrow you'll also clean the floor so you learn to be careful." There was no gesture of compassion or attempt at comfort, only indifference wrapped in authority. The girl picked up the pieces with trembling fingers. A drop of blood appeared on her index finger's tip, but she hid it by rubbing it against the already soaked dress. She had learned not to show weakness. Deep down, she wished her father would appear through the door and rescue her, but she knew that night he was in Miami piloting another flight. When she finished, Lucia sat for a moment on the stone step, her hands red and cracked. She looked toward the sky covered with clouds, searching among them for an airplane's lights. She imagined it was her father's flying over Boston, and that perhaps he was also thinking of her in that instant. She closed her eyes and hugged herself, letting the rain wash her tears mixed with water drops. Inside the house, Carmen closed the window and poured herself a glass of wine, satisfied with her own discipline. Soft music from a radio filled the living room, creating a cruel contrast with the patio's cold. Lucia, still outside, silently promised herself to endure a little longer. Maybe if she was good enough, Carmen would someday come to love her. That night, exhausted, the girl curled up in bed without dinner. The image of her deceased mother visited her in dreams, bringing her a warmth that reality denied her. Clinging to the pillow, she murmured barely, "Dad, come back soon." That night, Lucia fell asleep looking out the window, waiting to see her father's airplane lights return. Javier Ortega advanced down Newberry Street with firm steps, the uniform impeccable and cap under his arm. People looked at him with respect. A Delta pilot always inspired certain admiration. Some greeted him, others stepped aside to let him pass, and he responded with a cordial smile. Boston, with its historic buildings and academic air, seemed to receive him like a hero. However, beneath that appearance of success, Javier carried inside an uneasy sensation he couldn't define. He stopped at a cafe facing Trinity Church. The waiter, an older man with a gray mustache, recognized him and said, "The usual, Captain, black coffee." Javier nodded and took a seat by the window. From there, he contemplated the monumental facade illuminated by the afternoon sun. The aroma of hot chocolate invaded the place. At another table, some students laughed loudly. Everything seemed so normal, so everyday. And yet, something inside him didn't leave him in peace. A company colleague briefly joined him, praising his life. "You're a fortunate man, Javier. You fly around the world. You have a charming wife and a girl who idolizes you." Javier laughed out of courtesy, but those words stuck like a thorn. He thought of Lucia. Each time he returned from a flight, she received him with a smile so big it seemed to cover any pain. But wasn't that smile too big? Didn't it hide something behind it? As evening fell, he returned home. Lucia ran toward him as always, hugging him tightly. Javier lifted her and kissed her cheeks, noticing a slight smell of dampness in her clothes. Upon caressing her hands, he discovered the reddened skin with small cracks on the knuckles. "What happened here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Lucia quickly withdrew her hand and answered, "Nothing. Dad, I was playing with water on the patio." Javier frowned, but before insisting, Carmen appeared, impeccable as usual, bringing a tray with wine glasses. "Honey, don't exaggerate," she said with a sweet tone. "You know how Lucia is, always inventing strange games. Do you want to try this cheese I brought from the market?" She changed the subject skillfully, wrapping Javier in flattery and attention. During dinner, Javier observed in silence. Carmen talked about shopping, about a new dress, about the next trip they could take together. Lucia, meanwhile, barely touched the food, focused on moving a piece of bread with her fork. Javier looked at her fixedly and felt a knot in his stomach. His daughter was hiding something. After dinner, Carmen withdrew to talk on the phone in the living room. Javier sat next to Lucia on the bed. She showed him a drawing, an airplane over a gray sky and below a girl alone on a patio. "Is that you?" he asked with a broken voice. Lucia looked at him with big eyes, but instead of responding, carefully folded the paper and put it away in a notebook. Javier caressed her hair and tucked her in. "You know I'll always be with you, right?" Lucia nodded silently, though her gaze said otherwise. In that instant, Javier understood there was something deeper he didn't know, something that neither effusive hugs nor smiles could hide. He stood up, crossed the hallway, and looked out the window. Outside, the clouds accumulated and distant thunder announced the storm. He felt his home's calm was as fragile as that loaded sky. An announced storm for that week would change everything. The storm had fallen over Boston with unusual fury for fall. The clouds pressed over the rooftops, black and dense, discharging lightning that illuminated for seconds the church towers. The rain hit hard on the centuries-old bricks of the old neighborhood, transforming the cobblestone streets into dark mirrors. Javier Ortega advanced with quick steps, briefcase in one hand, cap under his arm, and uniform still impeccable despite the humidity. He had returned earlier than expected. A canceled flight in Miami allowed him to return to Boston 2 days early. He imagined Lucia's face upon seeing him enter without warning. He thought about hugging her, about having hot soup together for dinner. That expectation gave him warmth in the midst of the storm. Upon turning the corner of his street, he heard a strange sound, metallic, repeated. It wasn't the rain's rumor or the wind's whistle. It was the clash of dishes inside a basin. Javier stopped. His heart gave a leap. Who could be on the patio at those hours, under such a downpour? He walked slowly until the vision left him paralyzed. Lucia was there. The 8-year-old girl with her blue dress stuck to her body by water, blonde hair dripping over her face, hands reddened by cold, seated on a small wooden stool. She tried to scrub dishes inside a metal basin that filled with rainwater at every instant. Her fingers trembled so much she could barely hold the sponge. Mud mixed with food remains and dirty water splashed her legs. Javier felt the air escape his chest. He looked toward the living room's illuminated window, and there, firm as a statue, stood Carmen, standing with crossed arms. She observed the scene like someone supervising obligatory work. There was no compassion in her face, only coldness and cruel authority. Carmen's voice cut through the rain, dry, cutting. "Faster, Lucia. There are still glasses left." The girl barely raised her head, obeying with the docility of someone who has learned to be silent to avoid worse punishments. The pilot felt rage rise to his throat, mixed with unbearable pain. He dropped the briefcase, which fell on the flooded ground with a hollow sound. He ran toward his daughter, getting soaked in seconds, his shoes splashing on the slippery stones. Lucia saw him suddenly. Her eyes opened enormous, shining under tears and rain. The plate slipped from her hands and crashed against the floor, breaking into 1,000 pieces. Javier arrived in time to pick her up in his arms. He took off his pilot jacket and wrapped her desperately, trying to give her a warmth she no longer had. The girl's body trembled like a leaf in the wind. "Dad," she murmured with a barely audible voice, as if words weighed more than her own body. "I just want her to love me like you love me." Those words were like lightning falling directly on Javier's heart. He felt a stab of guilt so strong it almost knocked him down. How had he not seen it before? How had he been able to blindly trust Carmen and leave his daughter in those hands? Rain ran down his face, but he no longer distinguished if it was water or tears. He looked up. Carmen was still there behind the glass. When she understood she had been discovered, she stepped back. But her face showed no repentance, only irritation at having been caught. That coldness increased Javier's fury. With Lucia in his arms, he crossed the patio and pushed the door forcefully. He entered the house dripping water on the wooden floor. The living room's silence was unbearable, broken only by an antique clock's tick-tock and thunder's distant roar. Carmen tried to recover her composure, raising her chin as if she could still control the situation. Javier breathed agitatedly, his chest rising and falling. He caressed his daughter's head as she curled against him. And then, unable to contain himself anymore, he shouted with a broken voice that resonated throughout the house. "Carmen, what the hell is going on here?" The entire living room seemed to hold its breath. Rain continued hitting the windows with fury, and each thunder made the panes vibrate as if the storm wanted to enter. Javier stood in the middle of the room with Lucia in his arms, the girl trembling and hiding her face in his chest. The pilot's uniform dripped water on the wooden floor, but he didn't notice. All he saw was Carmen's haughty face, erect next to the table, as if she still had control of the situation. "Explain to me what this means," Javier demanded, his voice grave, broken by indignation. "You left her under a downpour scrubbing dishes until her hands bled." "My daughter is not your maid." Carmen didn't flinch. With excessive calm, she rested the wine glass on the tablecloth and crossed her arms. "Drop the drama, Javier. I was teaching her to be responsible. I don't plan to raise someone useless. If life puts obstacles in her way, she has to learn to resist, not to cry." "Resist?" Javier almost shouted, containing the impulse to hit something. "She's 8 years old. 8. At that age, she should be reading stories, drawing, laughing with her friends, not shivering under the rain like a beggar." Lucia clung tightly. She barely raised her head, enough to stammer, "Dad, I was afraid to tell you." Her little voice broke and she hugged him tighter. Javier held her desperately, as if wanting to erase all the months of silence and pain. Carmen advanced a step, defiant. "You don't understand anything, Javier. Where were you when she needed company? In the air, always in the air, traveling from city to city, wearing your uniform and receiving applause. I'm the one who stays here, who carries her character, her whims. If I don't put order, she'll grow weak without tools to face the world." The words cut deep. Javier felt a blow of guilt in his stomach. Yes, he had spent too many nights away, trusting Carmen would replace the maternal absence. He had closed his eyes to the signs. Lucia's red hands, her faded smile, the sad drawings she never wanted to show. Now everything fit like cruel puzzle pieces. "I entrusted you with the most valuable thing I have," Javier said, his voice broken but firm. "And you turned it into your target. It's not discipline, Carmen. It's cruelty disguised as authority." Carmen let out a dry laugh, almost mocking. "Cruelty? Because she scrubbed some dishes? How ridiculous that sounds. When I was a girl, my mother woke me at dawn to clean the entire house. That made me strong. Lucia needs the same, or she'll end up being a useless, spoiled child. Enough." Javier hit the table with his free hand and the silverware tinkled violently. Lucia shuddered, but upon looking at her father's eyes, discovered something new. It wasn't fury directed at her, but a protective fury, like a shield that finally defended her. Carmen turned halfway, walked slowly to the window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, the storm continued roaring, reflecting in her dark eyes. "You know that without me you can't handle everything," she murmured, almost like a challenge. "Your work consumes you, Javier. Today you say you'll protect her, but tomorrow you'll be on another flight, in another city, and she'll be left alone again. I'm the only one who can teach her not to depend on anyone." "You're wrong," Javier responded, each word firmer than the previous. "She doesn't need to learn not to depend on anyone. She needs to learn she can trust, that there's someone who will never leave her, and that someone will be me, even if I have to give up everything else." Lucia looked at him then with eyes shining with tears, and for the first time in weeks allowed herself to believe him. Her fingers clung to her father's soaked shirt as if those words were a lifeline. Carmen turned brusquely, her pride wounded. "This is how you repay me for everything? I gave you company when you were destroyed. I offered you a new life. You brought me to your house, gave me your name, and now you accuse me of being a witch over some broken dishes and a little rain." "No." Javier advanced toward her with Lucia still in his arms. Each step resonated on the wood, accompanied by the storm's echo. "It's not dishes or rain. It's tears. It's wounds on her hands. It's entire nights in silence with fear of speaking. A child doesn't invent that. That's real, and I won't allow it ever again." Thunder shook the house. Carmen paled. Her mask of serenity cracked. Rage and fear mixed in her expression, incapable of holding Javier's gaze. Dawn arrived silent, as if the city wanted to offer a respite after the storm. The sun's golden light illuminated Boston's church towers, making the brick shine like old gold. Javier Ortega walked slowly across the Longfellow Bridge with Lucia in his arms, wrapped in a blanket. The morning's cold air hit his face, but inside he felt a new warmth, that of a decision made. The previous night had been long. After the confrontation with Carmen, Javier could barely sleep. He had spent hours watching his daughter rest, exhausted, with her hair still damp from the rain. Each time he looked at her, he repeated the same truth to himself. He had failed her. He had left her too long alone in the wrong hands. And yet now he had the opportunity to repair that error. As they crossed the bridge, Lucia slowly opened her eyes. The rising sun reflected on the Charles River, creating sparkles that made her smile for the first time in a long while. "Dad, it's beautiful," she murmured, resting her head on his shoulder. Javier kissed her forehead and responded with tenderness. "Yes, my girl, and from now on you'll always see it with me." They left behind the house where they had lived with Carmen. Upon leaving, Javier didn't look back. He knew she watched them from the window, defeated in her pride. But she no longer had power over their lives. That cold home's closed door remained in the past. Father and daughter walked together to Faneuil Hall. At that early hour, cafes were beginning to open. The aroma of hot chocolate and freshly fried donuts extended through the arcades. Javier decided to enter a small cafe where the waiter, a man with a friendly mustache, greeted him with a good morning charged with familiarity. Lucia, still wrapped in the blanket, looked curiously at everything around her. Javier ordered a simple breakfast, donuts and hot chocolate for her, coffee with milk for him. While the girl timidly dipped a donut in the steaming cup, Javier contemplated her as if that everyday gesture were a miracle. "You'll never be alone again," he promised in a low voice. Lucia looked up and smiled at him, confident, with that mixture of innocence and gratitude that completely disarmed her father. Upon leaving the cafe, they took the path toward the grandparents' house located near the bridge. Mrs. Teresa and Mr. Manuel, Javier's parents, received them at the door with open arms. The smell of freshly baked bread escaped from the kitchen, and the home's warmth immediately enveloped them. Lucia threw herself into her grandmother's embrace, who held her tenderly while telling her, "You'll always have a place here, sweetheart." Javier observed the scene with moistened eyes. He felt that for the first time in a long while, his life found true meaning. It wasn't in the skies he traversed with his flights, or in luxury hotels in distant cities. It was there, in that instant, in his daughter's laughter and in his family's warmth. The cathedral bells ringing reached them, vibrating in the morning's fresh air. Javier closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had also had the courage to rectify them, and now, with Lucia clinging to his hand, he was ready to begin again. The cathedral bell resonated as a reminder that even the deepest wounds can heal with love. The storm had remained behind, but in the memory of those who witnessed this story, something deeper than thunder or rain kept beating, the trembling of a girl seeking refuge, and the awakening of a father who, after years of emotional absence, understood that his greatest flight wasn't in the skies but in his daughter's heart. Boston dawned with its streets still wet, shining under the sunlight, as if the city itself wanted to remember that after darkness always comes clarity. And to you who listen, I extend a small invitation. If this narration has touched your soul, leave a 1 in the comments. If you believe it could have been told differently, or want to add something, write a 0. What was essential wasn't the marital conflict or the broken dishes, but the discovery of a love that should never have been questioned. Javier understood that true wealth isn't measured in miles traveled or in respect earned by a uniform, but in the capacity to start over alongside those who need it most. Lucia, with her innocence, taught us that even a child's silence can be a cry for help, and that a timely embrace can become salvation. This story speaks to us of forgiveness's strength and the courage to assume responsibilities when it seems too late. The message is clear. Kindness and tenderness are forces that transform destinies, just like a lamp lit in an old house's window. A simple gesture, a word of encouragement, a sincere forgiveness. An extended hand can guide whoever feels lost in the midst of night. Haven't we all needed, at some moment in our lives, that discreet light that shows us the way? Whoever truly loves doesn't abandon. Whoever seeks to repair always finds a way to do it. In the maturity of years, many will remember the times they prioritized work, pride, or silence over affections. And perhaps this story serves to remind us we're still in time to look around and ask ourselves, have we given enough to those we love? Or have we let routine and distance freeze what once sustained us? In the end, what remains isn't the storm's echo or Carmen's harshness, but the certainty that love protects, forgives, and redeems. Javier decided to renounce false securities to build a true home. Lucia smiled again, and in that smile everything was summarized. The hope of a future in which affection is stronger than fear. Take an instant, dear listener, to think about your own family, about those you perhaps haven't called in weeks, about the hugs you can still give. If this story has moved you, share it with someone who also needs to hear it, because stories may end, but lessons endure. An authentic home isn't built with walls or roofs, but with the tenderness we know how to offer each day.